For centuries, samurai were the most powerful class in Japan, their authority cemented during the bloody Sengoku period. They weren't just warriors, they were the landlords, administrators, and lawmakers who held the country together throughout generations of conflict. So how was it that by the end of the 19th century, samurai as the world knew them were gone? The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 remains one of the most important events in Japanese history. Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory was a huge hammer blow to the opposing forces, and while resistance still remained until some 15 years later with the fall of Toyotomi Hideyori during the Siege of Osaka, the transition from a civil war that had raged for over a century to a time of peace and stability had already begun. The new shogun moved quickly to consolidate control and bring order with a series of sweeping changes. The commoner population were for the most part disarmed, and many samurai who until now maintained local military authority over rural lands no longer had to concern themselves with defending that land and were transitioned from their traditional warrior roles to bureaucratic positions inside castle towns across the country and the new capital of Edo. Further up the chain, the laws for military households from 1615 documented new restrictions on vassal lords. No longer were these daimyo permitted to arrange marriages designed to strengthen ties between houses, nor could they expand their castles or even repair damage without the strict approval of the shogunate. One daimyo, whose father, Kato Kiyomasa, was loyal to Tokugawa and helped keep the western forces occupied in Kyushu, was stripped of most of his land and placed under confinement after expanding his castle without permission. Japan had, in theory, been pacified, but by the mid-19th century, this feudal hierarchy faced growing civil unrest, corruption, and economic strain. Its decentralized nature granted significant autonomy to local officials, as well as wealthy merchants who were able to shape regional economies as they pleased, and as a result, commoners often faced harsh taxes, forced labor, judicial corruption, and in times of famine suffered greatly as officials hoarded rice. But another, and perhaps more dangerous, of the unintended effects of Tokugawa's new system was the mass displacement of samurai. Following the events at Sekigahara, the country was home to a substantial population of Ronin, and it's said that as time went on, the numbers increased to as many as 500,000, as samurai found military expertise no longer guaranteed a stable career. As houses waned in influence, samurai were dismissed for often financially motivated reasons. They also suffered from an increase in what were known as household disturbances, which usually involved infighting between factions vying for control of the daimyo, and sometimes these rivalries erupted into violence. The shogunate's response to this was to mete out heavy-handed punishments that could include the confiscation of fiefs and even the dissolution of domains, which, of course, would reduce an entire vassal force to Ronin status. Ronin existed in a kind of grey area of society. Many of the higher-ranked and more experienced were able to find new lords to serve and retain their samurai status, but the less fortunate took up work as farmers, labourers, merchants, or wandered the land as drifters, and a desperate few, on occasion, turned to banditry. There did exist, though, opportunities for the more enterprising amongst them, one example being in education. To limit the risk of rebellion, the shogunate expected daimyo to practice hereditary succession, preferring lords who inherited power rather than those who earned it by merit. This resulted in a generation of heirs with little to no practical military experience, and thus created a demand for Ronin veterans who could impart their martial wisdom. Furthermore, with their loss of status, came a restriction on training in domain or shogunate-sponsored academies, so private schools operated by Ronin who taught martial arts, strategy, and how to read and write to Ronin students weren't an uncommon sight within towns and cities. But it wasn't just warriors and the socially privileged who could benefit from this education. Some Ronin found it profitable to teach commoners in the countryside who possessed the means swordsmanship, and although some domains actively encouraged the training of local militias, an increase in unchecked commoners across the country who could fight and defend themselves wasn't something the shogunate was generally too keen on. It was a problem that persisted throughout the period, as seen in an 1805 edict to domains around the capital that read, "We have heard that in this region there are unemployed samurai wandering about. Peasants are learning martial arts and gathering together for practice, which might cause them to ignore their agricultural work. They forget their status and become uppity. They should be told to stop, and martial art instructors should not introduce their arts to the villagers." These positions, however, weren't the norm, and both Ronin and samurai alike were suffering from a class issue that left many in financial straits. They had always enjoyed a more comfortable lifestyle than most, but with their title becoming increasingly obsolete in a country free of war, poverty hit a significant number of them. Their income came in the form of hereditary stipends paid in rice by their daimyo, a system that had worked well enough during the Sengoku period when rice was the currency of a war economy. In an increasingly commercialized Edo, however, it failed to cover the cost required for life in the city. Ogyu Sorai, a Confucian philosopher living during the Tokugawa period, didn't hide his disdain for what he saw was the moral and social decline of Edo society. Samurai had, in his view, discarded the honor, respect, and discipline that made them so revered in favor of excess and opulence that harmed both their character and their pockets. One of the major causes of this, he believed, were the exploitative merchants who raised the price of commodities, all the while encouraging samurai to keep up appearances and live beyond their means. Residences, retainers, new clothing, even the high-quality polished rice they ate was an expense they could ill afford, forcing them to depend more and more on merchants for credit. Another samurai writer of the time noted, they head for guard duty wearing outfits they have conned the pawnbroker into restoring to them. Once they have come back from guard duty, they return the outfits. Their servants mock them for this. Sorai was extremely critical and wrote extensively on how to strip merchants of the financial power they had. This included sending samurai back to the countryside to reside over villages, as this would not only restore the hierarchical order between lords and peasants, but also give them control of the rice crop, and in his words, the merchants who will be forced to buy the rice in exchange for money will be utterly confounded, and it will be possible to bring the prices down to any level desired. Ronin were in a particularly difficult position, as not only had they fallen into financial ruin, but the line between class also blurred. The shogunate early on struggled to find a reasonable solution for the large number of these unemployed samurai whose very existence was becoming problematic, and instructed daimyo across the country to expel them from towns and refused to employ any that came looking for work. This compelled the Ronin to return to the countryside, where they often found themselves in the humiliating position of performing peasant work that was, quite frankly, unbefitting of a warrior. The shogunate had been, from the start, more than a little wary of idle swordsmen, and not without good reason. In the wake of 3rd Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu's death in 1651, unravelled a plot led by disgruntled Ronin to overthrow the government. During Iemitsu's 28-year reign, tens of thousands of samurai had been displaced and deprived of income due to daimyo being relieved of their lands, and the martial arts schools they attended became a breeding ground for discontent as these men confided in one another their shared social and financial woes. Two, in particular, Yui Shosetsu and Marubashi Chuya, exposed and exploited this issue to move against the shogunate. It's said that as a child, Yui showed great promise in his village and was taken in by a group of local Ronin who taught him the country's recent history. He became inspired by the stories of Sengoku ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a boy who rose from a poor family who went on to rule the country. Marubashi, on the other hand, came from a respected samurai family, but burning within him his whole life was the need to avenge the death of his father, who died at the hands of Tokugawa forces during the siege of Osaka in 1615. These two men found themselves instructing many lowly and impressionable samurai who increasingly directed their ire towards the shogunate, and soon the pair had garnered enough support to take action. According to Tokugawa authorities, their plan was twofold. Using barrels of gunpowder, Marubashi was to set the capital ablaze on a windy night and use the ensuing chaos to storm the castle, killing as many high-ranking officials as they could get their hands on. Meanwhile, Yui would lead an assault in Sunpu, modern-day Shizuoka, with more raids planned in Kyoto and Osaka. Unfortunately for them, this coup ended before it even began. Marubashi fell ill and, in his delirium, shared the details of their plan. They postponed it for a couple of months, but by that time the authorities were well aware of their scheme, and both men, along with their followers, suffered horrible fates. Yui and his men, who had evaded authorities for a time, committed seppuku after being surrounded in Sunpu, while Marubashi and his group were captured, brutally tortured and executed. And it didn't end there. Such was the outrage of this conspiracy, even the wives and children of those involved didn't escape punishment. They were all decapitated. This event was enough to force the government into decisive action. One councillor, Abe Tadaki, in the face of calls to ban all Ronin from Edo, which had already proved to be ineffectual, took a more proactive position, instead proposing to end the policies that were financially harming Ronin and lower samurai, and to make efforts to find suitable employment as guards or in administrative roles. This helped, but it wasn't enough, and there still existed in the capital a good number of Ronin who just weren't suitable for such work, and without the rigidity of military life to keep them well paid, well fed, and in check, drifted towards the darker side of Edo society to find work as bodyguards, become gamblers, or even form gangs. One of the more colourful groups that was largely made up of Ronin and lower samurai who weren't in line for succession was known as Kabuki Mono. Being pulled further towards the wrong side of the ever-growing status line that separated samurai and commoners, they expressed their frustrations in violent and extravagant ways. Kabuki Mono are known to have partaken in all sorts of deviant behaviour, like brawling in the streets, thieving, and running protection rackets. While visually they set out to provoke societal norms, they often wore excessively short or women's kimonos, styled long, loose hair rather than the traditional topknot, and their long swords rested in flashy red scabbards, with one existing blade proclaiming the general sentiment that represented the group: "I have lived too long." They lived in rejection of a system they felt abandoned them, pledging more loyalty to each other than their actual families or the samurai masters they served, and were willing to die for one another. This was the case with the high-profile revenge killing of one of the shogun's own military chiefs. Shibayama Gonzaemon killed one of his servants, which in most cases wouldn't have caused much of a stir, only this time the servant belonged to the Kabukimono, and when word reached his friend, who was also Shibayama's servant, he arrived at the scene and killed his master on the spot. It's important to remember, though, that the flamboyant Kabukimono and other undesirables who filled Edo's underworld were the exception rather than the rule. The majority of Ronin, despite their fall from grace, carried themselves with the same sense of dignity that was instilled in them since training began in childhood. Arai Hakuseki was another Tokugawa Confucian scholar who, in his biography, recounted a story told by his father, an instance where a Ronin had lost everything except the embodiment of his beliefs. He writes that on his travels, his father encountered an old friend living in poverty at the foot of a mountain. They spoke all night about their past deeds over a fire before the Ronin pulled out 2 bamboo tubes, opened the ends and drew out his swords. They were as well maintained as they always had been. He then said, "I do not regret any part of the equipment I possessed in the past, but while my strength lasts, I intend to keep my set of swords with me." This Ronin could be seen as the personification of the entire samurai class, fading into memory and holding on to something the country seemingly had no use for. And the shogunate who created and perpetuated this reality was itself beginning to unravel. It had spent the better part of 2 centuries suppressing internal dissent by keeping its lords divided and its people in their place. So in the 1800s, when foreign ships were arriving in increased numbers and persistence amid the political, economic, and social turmoil, there was no unified voice or strategy, and little experience of the world beyond its own shores. This presence of Western imperialism, in fact, reignited the samurai sense of honor within Japan's warrior class. With news of the Opium War and China's defeat spreading throughout the country, panic and a desire to remain independent was met with a renewed sense of national pride, and many samurai felt that the shogunate yielding to Western pressures to open the country was shameful. Yoshida Shoin was a samurai from Choshu, and in his short but storied life, popularized the philosophy which struck at the same national sense of shame that would eventually lead to the shogunate's downfall. From a young age, he was recognized for his talent, so much so that at age 11 he was already lecturing the daimyo on military strategy. He was later reduced to Ronin status after leaving the domain without permission in order to study in Edo and in the north of the country, and it was during this period that he developed the ideology that would see him known as one of the most radical political activists in the country. Shoin is described by historical sociologist Eiko Ikegami as having reformulated honor as the mainspring of human dignity, pride in one's individuality expressed through political action for the sake of a better social order. It was completely at odds with the actions of the shogunate, and at the age of 29, Shoin was executed for a plot to assassinate a Tokugawa official. But by this point it was already too late. His philosophy had spread, samurai were gripping onto their own sense of honor and increasingly reaching the conclusion that it would be found only in loyalty to the emperor in Kyoto. The turning point for the shogunate arrived with the US Admiral Matthew Perry in 1853, who demanded on behalf of the president that trade be opened between the 2 countries. To make matters worse, Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu died just a couple of weeks after Perry's first visit, and they faced the same issue ruling families had dealt with for centuries: weak successors. Ieyasu, the 13th Tokugawa shogun, had suffered from illness his whole life, and often let others make important decisions for him, with the America question being no different. Daimyo across the country were asked for their opinions in an unusually broad consultation that exposed the deep divisions within the government, with answers ranging from completely opening Japan up to trade to rejecting all approaches, even if it led to war. They finally made the decision to sign a treaty with America in 1854 and another in 1858, the second proving far more divisive. Many daimyo and samurai were so critical of it, it proved to be the final straw, causing them to turn their backs entirely on the shogunate in favour of the imperial court. Over the following decade, opposition to the shogunate continued to grow. Powerful domains like the Satsuma and Choshu aligned themselves with the imperial court, and this rift turned into political violence with a series of high-profile assassinations. The earlier disagreement about foreign policy soon evolved into a question of who should rule Japan. In 1868, conflict finally broke out in what would come to be known as the Boshin War between the Tokugawa loyalists and those who believed political rule should be restored to the emperor. It was a relatively short conflict that saw the imperial forces emerge victorious, bringing an end to more than 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. For many samurai who fought under the banner of the emperor, they did so under the impression that Japan would return to a traditional warrior rule, that samurai would once more dominate Japan's social and political world. But in an ironic twist, the new Meiji oligarchy, which itself was made up of samurai, quickly set about dismantling that very system. The Meiji Restoration saw domains abolished, the public wearing of swords banned, and hereditary samurai stipends exchanged for bank bonds. And while some lower-ranked samurai were able to make the transition more comfortably, for high-ranking samurai, the returns on these bonds felt like a slap in the face. The decisive blow came with the formation of a national army and military conscription for commoners, a move that saw the final vestiges of the warrior class all but vanish. It wouldn't be accurate to say all were devastated by these policies. Quite a few samurai were more than happy to see the end of that way of life, as it meant they were now free of obligation and able to pursue whatever careers they wished. But that didn't stop a significant number of them feeling betrayed, and no one better describes this feeling of betrayal than Saigo Takamori of the Satsuma domain. Playing an instrumental role in overthrowing the shogunate, he became a highly influential political figure within the new Meiji government, earning the position of imperial counselor and general in the army. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally charismatic and physically imposing. He treated all those under his command, even down to common soldiers, with a great deal of respect, something that wasn't very common for someone of his standing, and this was repaid with fierce loyalty. He oversaw the reforms that introduced military conscription and the formation of a national army. His issue, however, wasn't that the traditional warrior class was disappearing before his very eyes. It was that the new government was leaning overly towards the West and the corruption he saw. As someone who was devoutly nationalistic with a high sense of morality, he became wary of his role and finally resigned in 1873, returning to his native Kagoshima, where he spent his days fishing and hunting. Then, a year later, he helped establish schools in the region that taught education and military training based on samurai values of morality. And as with those that fostered the Ronin conspiracy to overthrow the shogunate a couple of centuries earlier, Saigo's strong beliefs instilled anti-government discussion. Several small conflicts had already broken out across the country, and while Saigo found himself sympathetic to these samurai rebels, he was hesitant to lead a rebellion himself. That was until 1876, when it was learned from tortured confessions that government spies had been sent to kill him. By 1877, his zealous students, after learning of the assassination plot, seized a large arsenal of weapons. Saigo, it should be noted, in no way supported their actions, yet vowed to fight and die with them. Around 12,000 men marched under Saigo's command in February of that year, only making it some 80 miles north before hitting resistance at Kumamoto Castle. Their siege lasted 54 days, which critically gave the imperial government time to organize a substantial force to deal with them. The Satsuma rebels suffered a decisive defeat in March after an 18-day-long battle, their decimated ranks retreating back through Kyushu with the imperial army on their heels. The rebellion lasted 8 months and resulted in the deaths of thousands of samurai, including Saigo himself. Events surrounding his final moments are disputed, but one legend goes that after a valiant last stand in Kagoshima, which left him heavily wounded by a gunshot, he was unable to perform seppuku and was beheaded by his second, Beppu Shinsuke. Regardless of whether there's any truth to this version of events, or if he bled out unceremoniously on the battlefield, one thing that isn't disputed is that with his death, the country was unified, and samurai were, for all intents and purposes, gone. An interesting aspect of the samurai is that historians argue this romantic concept we have of Bushido and the way of the warrior was chiefly created after the samurai disappeared. In the face of increasing anxiety regarding westernization and the country's need for some kind of cultural anchor, writers, philosophers, and politicians like Nitobe Inazo put forth their own differing interpretations. In 1900, Nitobe published Bushido, The Soul of Japan, an idealized version of Bushido written in English that found popularity in the West following Japan's victory over the Russian Empire in 1905. The samurai within are portrayed largely as we know them today, with honor, loyalty, and virtue the main pillars that each and every warrior upheld. A few years prior, journalist and politician Ozaki Yukio described Bushido in a way that was more closely aligned to the Western idea of chivalry and gentlemanliness. Then we have someone like Inoue Tetsujiro, a philosopher who was much more interested in promoting Bushido as a national identity with a militaristic focus on loyalty to the emperor. Although all of these interpretations were drawing from the same source, they all agree on very little, and it's clear that Bushido became less about the full and often complicated reality of the samurai, and more about who could reshape their legacy to suit national, political, or cultural agendas. And this reinvention continued. Historian Michael Wirt put forth that the post-World War II economic boom of the 1960s produced its own version of the samurai, the salaryman, a dark-suited corporate warrior defined by absolute loyalty to his company, long work hours, and a sense of duty over self. And I suppose you could, if you wanted, draw some similarities between samurai drinking with their lords out of obligation and salarymen drinking themselves to excess during their weekly work drinking party at the behest of their boss. So perhaps the samurai didn't truly disappear, they just evolved.